Good evening, everyone. I'm Sherry Gleed, and I am delighted to welcome you to our NYU Wagner celebration of 75 years of public service education. 75 years of preparing students to be effective leaders in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. 75 years of faculty research that has transformed the way people understand and act on critical social issues, and you'll be hearing a little bit about that in a minute. 75 years of being a hub of innovation, reflection, ideas, and action to improve societies around the world. We're here tonight to celebrate remarkable individual and collective achievements and to open the book on our next 75 years of continued success. I want to extend a special welcome to the former NYU Wagner deans who are here with us today, Bob Byrne and Ellen Schall. And also to Dean Lynn Videcka from the Social Work School, which used at one time to be part of the School of Public Administration as well. I'd like to thank Bob and Ellen, as well as Joe Ivy Buford and Alan Altschuler and Scott Fritzen, all former deans, for serving on our event host committee, along with current NYU Wagner faculty members John Billings, Gordon Campbell, David Elcott, Ingrid Gould-Ellen, Anthony Kovner, Mitchell Moss, and Sonia Ospina, and many, many other NYU Wagner alumni and friends. So thank you very much. And I want to thank a very generous Wagner graduate who is our event chair and who wishes to remain anonymous. It's great to have the support of so many members of our community, so I'd like to have everyone on the host committee stand for just a moment so we can acknowledge your generosity. I also want to thank our fabulous staff planning committee members who worked so hard to prepare a fabulous evening for everyone, especially Tracy Gardner, David Schachter, Scott Sowell, Hollis Calhoun, Serby Lal, Jamie O'Regan, Andrew Lina, Brian Stern, Brian Roach, and Rachel Sala. So thanks, Rachel Sala Grant. Thank you, all of you. I'm a relative newcomer to Wagner. I'm just completing my first year as dean. It's been wonderful. But as this event suggests, Wagner goes way back. We reached into the archives and discovered several interesting facts. We graduated our first class of about 40 MPA students in 1939. Back then, we were called the Graduate School of Public Administration. We grew to include a doctoral program, an urban planning program, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, and also an executive MPA program. And we continue to grow, adding a health program and specializations in management, policy, finance, and international. Over time, we expanded our reach from mostly local students who attended school part-time to include students from across the US and the world, most of whom attend on a full-time basis. Last month, we graduated the largest class in our history, 425 students, and our current student body includes about 1,000 students who come from more than 25 states in the US and more than 20 countries around the globe. We can track more than 12,000 alumni who live and work in communities all over the world. We're currently ranked the number 6 school of our type, and I am proud of our remarkable trajectory, and I want to thank our former deans, our faculty, and our entire community for helping us achieve this notable success. Our alumni are our proof of concept. They work in a variety of issues and fields. They span sectors. They work locally, nationally, and globally. And I could talk about them all night. But instead, during the cocktail reception, you will see a slideshow that highlights the breadth of what our alumni are doing. There are more than 100 alumni included in our slideshow, representing just a small fraction of the tremendous work that you all do. We're so proud of you, and we encourage you to continue to let us know about your professional successes and your life so we can include you in our next slideshow and the impact you're having on public service. Again, thank you all for being here to celebrate this important milestone in NYU Wagner's history. We talk a lot about the NYU Wagner community, and we devote a lot of attention to making sure ours is a community that includes students, faculty, and staff. We take pride in telling our students that once you join, you're a Wagnerd for life. The rest of your life promise is very real, and as evidence of it, we have a group of NYU Wagner faculty members who've been with us for more than 25 years, and we'd like to celebrate them this evening. I'm going to call each of them by name, and I'd like to ask all of you to remain on stage so we can get a group photo after we get all of our 25-year club up here. So first, Sonia Ospina. She's professor of public management and policy. She's been at Wagner for 25 years. Beth Weitzman, who's professor of health and public policy and vice dean and now acting dean at NYU Steinhardt, who's been at Wagner for 27 years. Roger Croft, who's professor of health policy and management and retired last year after 28 years at Wagner. Chuck Brescher, professor of public and health administration, who's retiring in August after 34 years at Wagner. Tony Kovner, who's professor of public and health management and has been with us for 35 years. Bob Byrne, professor of public policy and financial management and executive vice president for health at NYU. He was also associate dean and dean at Wagner and has been on our faculty for 38 years. Leanna Stiefel, who is professor of economics and started at Wagner at 12 because she's been with us for 38 years. Mitchell Moss, who is Henry Hart Rice Professor of Urban Policy and Planning and has been at Wagner for 41 years. Dennis Smith, Associate Professor of Public Policy, who has also been at Wagner for 41 years. And rounding out that amazing class of 41-year veterans, Professor Ray Zimmerman, Professor of Planning and Public Administration. We have 3 other 25-year-plus faculty who weren't able to join us this evening: Victor Rodwin, Steve Finkler, and Roy Sparrow. Please join me in congratulating this stellar group of NYU faculty. Thank you very much. Congratulations. So early on, when I became dean, I went on a listening tour to talk to our alumni and get a better sense of what they think Wagner does and also what they think we should do differently. And I heard from many of you that in addition to more networking opportunities and more parties, I did hear that Wagner has excellent parties, you also want to hear a little bit more about what the faculty are up to, about faculty research. And I'm therefore excited to present today 4 WAG Talks, which is our version of TED Talks, by 4 of our really distinguished faculty. We're going to hear first from Professor Jonathan Mordick. He's professor of public policy and economics. Jonathan has worked for a long time studying finance issues in the developing world, but more recently, he's turned his attention to the U.S. context. You may have read about his exciting new work in the New York Times Magazine just this past February, and now is your chance to learn about the U.S. Financial Diaries Project from Jonathan himself. Jonathan.
Thank you. Hi, happy birthday, Wagner. It's really nice to be here talking about something very new and, as Sherry was saying, very different. I want to start off with an event or a phenomenon which is, I think, warming the wonky hearts of those of us who follow things like poverty and inequality, which is that a book, a very wonky, big book, 700 pages of charts and tables and figures on inequality, is flying off the shelves, and on Sunday will be the #2 book on the New York Times bestseller list, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. I want to start with this because what Piketty does is, one, very different from what I'm going to talk about, but also notable is that he takes the long view in trying to understand the development of the US and other richer countries. And this is the big graph, or one of the big graphs that comes out of the book. And I was looking at it the other day and thinking, well, this is sort of a part of Wagner's story. Wagner was founded, before it was even Wagner, at a time when inequality in the US was at historical highs. The top 10% of the US, in terms of earning, including capital gains earnings, was about 45% of total income earned in the country. As Wagner grew and moved into its youth, inequality in the US started to fall. The World War II, the Great Depression, and the destruction of wealth there led to a very different economy, a very different situation. But the last 40 years had seen a big rise, and this is really Piketty's story, and this is really the backdrop through which Wagner and Wagner's faculty and NYU in general has been sort of working and trying to understand how one helps build a stronger country and a stronger globe, while also being concerned that the distribution of gains goes broadly. And so alongside that change in inequality is also this. In that same period from 1970 to 2010, poverty has been flat and it remains flat. And that's really the beginning point of the project that I want to share now. One of the things about Piketty's project with sort of long-run historical data is that it gives us a very broad view of things. But it doesn't give us a detailed view of what's happening to the lives of Americans as they get through the year, as they get through their day, their week, their months, and how they actually live their lives and how that's changed over time. So we can look at data like this, but it doesn't really give us purchase on how to really think through policy that can make people's lives better. And so one of the things that we're finding that I want to stress in the next few minutes is that our focus has been on inequalities of income, and with Piketty's work, increasingly inequalities in wealth. But there's another fundamental inequality that gets lost because we don't see it in the kind of data we have, and that's inequality in steady, reliable, predictable finances. Steady jobs, the ability to know what's going to happen in the next month and the month after that. That there's an inequality that's been growing in America that's along those dimensions, and it's really changing things in terms of the policy environment and possible solutions. The data that we've been focusing on comes from 4 sites. We decided to just step back from the usual data that gets collected and spend a year with about 250 households, some in Northern California in the agricultural communities around San Jose, some in Eastern Mississippi, Southern Ohio, Northern Kentucky, and here in Brooklyn and Queens. The idea was to get to know a smaller group of families, but to really get to know them, to try to track every dollar spent, every dollar earned, every dollar borrowed, every dollar saved. And so really have a fine-grained view of a small number of people's lives. And in that way, trying to get away from the sort of annual year-to-year data, and for once, take a look at something that's closer to a real diary. And so to capture the day-to-day, week-to-week existence that is actually how we get through life. So the project involved creating a research group that lived in the different regions and met with families every 2 to 4 weeks and built up the stories of their lives, built up trust, and got to see strategies and changes in people's lives, challenges that are usually hard to see and never collected in the kind of data that we usually are working with and collecting. And so we were looking at working poor families, about 1/3 of them poor, about 1/3 near poor, and about 1/3 in the middle class. Different ethnic groups, different immigration groups, and the kind of the binding insight as we move forward was to follow their income and follow their assets as usual, but do something new and different, which is also very closely follow cash flows. And so it's that focus on cash flows which has really changed the way that we're understanding the economic lives and the financial lives of the households. Over the last few years, we've collected, well, over this 1-year period for the households, we've collected 300,000 different cash flows for this 250 family sample, as well as 460,000 answers to questions on health and tax refunds, financial instruments, aspirations, all those kinds of things that we as social scientists think about. So let me tell you about one family to give you a sense of what we're finding in the data. This is the Garza family. They live in Northern California. Ricardo Garza works construction, and he has a pretty steady job in that he earns $400 a week in his construction job. But it's not enough to make ends meet. So he's also got a side job where he's doing a little remodeling with a friend. His wife also is doing a little work to make ends meet. She's selling jewelry and clothing online, and she's also taking in kids and acting as a babysitter, making money in childcare. And this story is really the story that we see again and again, this kind of picture. This is the year, and you can see the income, the total household income going up and down. And it's the ups and downs which create the tensions and challenges in the Garza's life. On average, if we just looked at the annual data, they're doing fine. They earn about, on average, $2,800 a month. They're spending a little less than that. They look fine. But what's hard for the Garzas, and for so many households we're getting to know, is that that $2,800 is just the average. And in some months, they're as low as $1,600. In some months, they have $5,000. So holding on to those gains and dealing with those difficult periods is really the challenge that we're seeing households face. And for the Garzas, they're turning to pawn shops, they're taking on costly loans, they're maxing out credit cards when their income dips. Even though on average, year to year, in the annual data, they're looking fine. We just don't see it in the data we collect. So it's not just the Garzas. This is a graph that shows the swings in income of all the families in Northern California. And they all have these ups and downs throughout the year. The ups and downs are coming from a number of different sources. One of the sources is greater instability in labor income. We ask the households, and we look at how stable their different jobs are. About a quarter of them are saying their jobs are not very steady in terms of hours and income, or not steady at all. And we're seeing this playing out in different ways across our sample. But the other thing which is striking, and this goes to that hidden inequality that I started with, is that when we look at the poorest and then least poor, and this is actually from a national survey that's not ours but connects to ours, and we look at the middle rungs in the distribution. When we look at the volatility of income throughout the year, it's really the poorest who have the most volatile income, and that the volatility of income gets lower and lower as you get better off. The bottom line is, as income goes up, it's not just that you're earning more money, you're also moving into better jobs. And so the households that have the lowest income are also not only dealing with that, but dealing with the greatest uncertainty and unpredictability in their lives. The households that are least well set to deal with that kind of volatility. What that leads to is no surprise. Almost all households in our sample have at least 1 month where they're spending more than they have. They're running overdrafts on the checking accounts, about half of them. About a quarter of them have 2 or more overdrafts. About 3/4 of them aren't paying their credit cards in full from month to month, and about 1/3 of them are maxing out their credit cards and have no room to maneuver. So they're using the devices they have, but the devices aren't working that well for them. The Pew Charitable Trust runs a survey every year, focuses on how American households are doing, and every year they ask this question, which is, if you had to choose, would you rather move up the income ladder, earn more income, but hold everything else the same, or keep your income where it is, but have more stability, more financial stability than you have now? And the answer to that Pew survey lines up with what we're seeing across the country. In the Pew survey, 85% of respondents say they would rather have more financial stability and stay where they are than earn extra income. We're seeing that same response. We asked the same question to our households, and for the poor, the near poor, and households in the moderate income middle class, it's all about the same, 70, 80% saying it's really financial stability that they're searching for rather than moving up the income ladder. And that changes how we think about approaches to poverty and low-income households, and changes how we think about policy. The problem essentially that we're seeing is that households are facing lots of ups and downs in needs and ups and downs in income. And there's this great mismatch. And it's the mismatch which creates all the tension. With better financial services and better jobs, hopefully, that mismatch can resolve itself and come into better alignment. And with that, households can be in a much better place. So in terms of policy, we often think about poor and low-income households and think, well, you know, their finances are difficult. What we really need to do is provide better financial literacy training, or help people save, or maybe there's some behavioral economics nudges that we could think about to help them. But our evidence shows that that's really insufficient for the households we get to know. They really need better tools, not just better advice. And those tools are ways to deal with emergencies better, that really deal with the ups and downs much more easily, ways to create lump sums and hold onto them, and ways to clear financial space in order to focus on some of these harder choices. And so when we think about the challenges, and we think about poverty, we look at data like this, we've got to remember that the annual data is powerful and tells an important story. But behind that data are households that are not living year to year, they're living week to week and month to month. And that opens up policy possibilities, product possibilities, new ways to think about how to help households that are struggling today move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. And now we're going to hear from Ingrid Guldalan, who's Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning and who directs our Master's in Urban Planning program and is director of the Furman Center for Real Estate and Policy. She's an expert on housing, especially in New York City, and she's going to speak about something that's very salient, especially to those of us who live here, which is the costs and benefits of historic preservation. Ingrid.
Thank you, Sherry, and let me add my welcome and happy birthday to Wagner as well. I'm going to talk about historic districts today, as Sherry said. I want to say that this is very much co-authored work, although I want to be clear that Vicki Bean worked on this project before she was appointed Commissioner of New York City, so our conclusions reflect neither the views of HBD nor the views of the Federal Reserve, where another co-author, Wagner alum Mike Adal, now work. So get those disclaimers out of the way. Preservation advocates and their critics have been debating the merits of preservation for decades, and nowhere has that debate been more fierce than in New York City, where the preservation community was really galvanized by the demolition of much beloved Penn Station, and which led to the creation of the Landmark Preservation Commission in 1965, and some 50 years later, we have about 113 historic districts in New York City. And I'm going to talk about one, our research really is focused mostly on one aspect of that debate, which is whether the designation of historic districts, how that designation affects property values. And in particular, whether the designation of historic districts increases or decreases the value of properties within districts, and how the designation affects the value of properties immediately surrounding historic districts. I'm not going to give a full-blown exposition of our theory, but the answer is that it depends, and the basic intuition is that historic preservation brings both benefits and costs. So the good news is that you can be assured that the historic character of your neighborhood will be preserved. And the bad news, of course, is that as an owner, the designation restricts your ability to redevelop your property. So for example, if you live on this lovely West Village street, you can be assured that the presence of the Greenwich Village Historic District means that your neighbors across the street can't tear down their buildings and build this in their place. Okay, for those of you that don't recognize this building, this is actually the HUD building in New York, in Washington, where Kathy O'Regan now works. And this is a building that HUD Secretary Sean Donovan, an architect himself, affectionately calls 10 floors of basement. But of course, on the other hand, right, so the good news is that you can be sure that your neighbors across the street won't tear down their homes. The bad news is, of course, that at the same time, you can't tear down your home either and rebuild. And so on net, then, this combination of benefits and costs leads us to predict that sort of unambiguously, we think that the designation of historic districts should increase the value of the properties immediately surrounding districts, right? Because those properties get the best of both worlds in some sense, right? On the one hand, they get the benefits of this being near adjacent to this beautiful historic district. On the other hand, they don't face any of the restrictions on altering their property, right? Now, when we think about what happens to property values, the values of properties within districts, the story's a little bit more complicated, right? And what we predict is basically that that designation should boost property values in neighborhoods where the amenity value is very high, and at the same time, the value of the option to redevelop those properties is relatively low. Okay? So owners are giving up less. That's where property values will increase. And let me just give you another example. So in historic districts and sort of single-family home neighborhoods like this Harrison Street in Staten Island, we would expect that historic designation here should increase property values, because it turns out in this neighborhood in Staten Island, you couldn't, even without the historic district, you actually wouldn't be allowed to build a tall building in this neighborhood. And even if you were allowed to, it wouldn't be nearly as valuable as a tall building in Manhattan. And so owners of properties in districts like Harrison Street are not giving up as much as owners in Greenwich Village, right, who are losing a lot by the restriction on their ability to tear down their home and build a tall building like the ones in a very valuable building like the ones in the background of this photograph. So how do we test this? In brief, I'm not going to go get through all the statistical bells and whistles, but in brief, basically what do? We compare the value of homes that are inside historic districts, right, to the value of homes that are just outside districts and their buffer, but still in the same neighborhood. And then we compare how that differential changes after the designation of the district. This is just called a difference in difference method, okay? And what do we find? We basically find, as predicted, that the value of properties in the buffer zone immediately surrounding districts do increase with time after designation, just as we predict. Again, these are the properties that sort of get the benefit of both worlds. Secondly, we also find that on average, citywide, that property values in districts increase after designation. Again, this is on average citywide. Okay, but then when we look at Manhattan, we see a very different story. In Manhattan, and this again, this is as predicted by the theory, property values actually fall after designation. Okay, now I want to be clear that this is not always statistically significant, but again, this is consistent with their theory, because in Manhattan, property owners, the lost value, the lost option to redevelop your property in Manhattan is very, very high. It's much higher than in other boroughs of the city. And so property owners in historic districts in Manhattan are giving up a lot when their area gets districted. Okay? So I want to be clear that this research doesn't end debates about preservations, to be sure. We're not considering the impact of the benefits of that architectural preservation to city residents more generally outside of the neighborhood, to people outside of New York altogether. We're also not considering the potential costs of the increase in housing prices that results from the restriction in supply. But we do hope that these findings do help to add some nuance to the debate and ultimately help to inform the difficult choices that decision makers have to make. So thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. And our third TED Talk is going to be by Dan Smith, who is Associate Professor of Public Budgeting and Financial Management. Dan directs our finance program, and today he's going to talk about something in the news every day. Why do cities go bankrupt? Dan.
Okay, this is the Law and Order talk. It's ripped from the headlines. So there's a couple things I want to say at the outset. Bankruptcy is debt restructuring. It's not the fall of government. It's not the destruction of government. It's something to be taken seriously, but it's just not the sort of dystopic thing that you see in the headlines. The second thing I want to say is, for each of these three cases, I'm going to highlight some factors that I would argue are the key factors behind the municipal bankruptcies. But behind all of them, there was long-term economic decline and the financial crisis. I mean, bankruptcies are rare anyway, but they were almost non-existent before the financial crisis. So even though I won't highlight the financial crisis and long-term economic decline for all of them, Those were factors for every one of them. Now, for those of you in the ratings agencies, you know this story. You can play with your phones, whatever you need to do. So Detroit is the biggest bankruptcy in the history of the United States in terms of dollars. So when it comes to Detroit, really the entire story is about economic decline. The Detroit of today is not the Detroit of the 1950s to the 1990s. It's industry and all the taxpayers and all the tax-paying corporations with it left. And actually, Detroit hollowed out quite literally, geographically, in a way that most jurisdictions don't. Most of the economic activity that left the middle of the city. So the city was left with two service zones that had to traverse a desert to serve the other side of the city, which makes things more expensive. The thing about government is that when you lose your revenue, you can't just get rid of all your costs. You can't rip out all the sewers, you can't roll up the sidewalks. You have some limited ability to sell buildings, but whereas a business could sell essentially everything and restart somewhere else, maybe lease a smaller office or have a different operation altogether, in government your costs are very high and they're fixed. The physical assets, but also the personnel. If you have to keep the sewer line, you have to keep the people who keep the sewer line working. And also some of the other fixed costs. You might say, well, there's fewer people, so cut the police. But it led to urban blight that actually increased crime. Not a really good time to cut the police. So we had a hollowing out of the revenue. The fixed costs were there and high. It basically led to what is a classic story in bankruptcy. You know, the federal bankruptcy code has chapters 7, 9, and 11. 9 is for the municipalities of the United States. This is classical. When your liabilities outpace your assets in a structural way and you cannot catch up, that's when you declare bankruptcy, whether you're a person, a corporation, or a municipality. If you just look at the right axis here, that's the size of liabilities relative to assets. So a negative number is good, meaning you have more assets than liabilities. A positive number is bad. Going from 2002 to 2012, Detroit went from a really solid place where the liabilities were 25% smaller than the assets, and by 2012 it grew to be over 20% bigger, or 25% bigger than the assets. So they just have no structural ability to catch up. They don't have the people, they still have the fixed costs. I don't have a graph here with pensions, because when it comes to Detroit, everybody wants to talk pensions. But if you look at the raw data for Detroit, their pension is really not much of a story. Yes, they have lots of personnel, lots of fixed costs personnel-wise. Those are non-trivial. Nonetheless, this is not a story of pensions the way that Stockton, California is, I would argue. So that's Detroit, basically a classic bankruptcy story. You have one reality, things are going well, you have substantial assets relative to your liabilities, you have inflows, you can manage your costs. You lose those inflows, your costs stay where they are, your liabilities grow relative to your assets, and you have no structural way to pay your way out of them. Not the most appealing thing, but that's a sewer treatment plant. So Jefferson County, Alabama, I found out in doing this research, there's a ton of Jefferson counties. I guess a lot of odes to Thomas Jefferson. So in the South, municipalities have very little independent taxing authority. The state essentially dictates the extent to which they can raise their revenues. And what Jefferson County encountered, again, was long-term economic decline coupled with what a lot of governments are facing, which is decline in their infrastructure. So they had what I call great expectations. They said, well, let's try to tackle two birds with one stone. We have declining infrastructure, our sewer system was literally leaking raw sewage into two rivers in the area. The EPA was not happy with their sewer system. And they said, well, maybe we can create some jobs by renovating this thing. They had very little taxing authority. They had very little ability to do much about this situation. So what they did was what a government would generally do. They issued lots and lots of bonds, $4 billion in revenue bonds. Revenue bonds are backed by the revenue generated by the project. So the theory was, we'll issue all these bonds, we'll get a cash inflow, we'll pay it off with the water bills we get from our residents. I'll circle back to how this happened in a minute, but the problem was they didn't really get to building sewer pipes and replacing the sewer pipes that were decrepit. They built a lot of administrative buildings, filtration systems, pump stations, but they didn't replace any of the pipes. So what they ended up with was a lot of debt that forced them to quadruple the water bill, and they had no improved infrastructure. So that made people howl. People were not happy. They said, you're not going to increase our water bill again, or you're basically going to get a revolt. So what they did was they turned to Wall Street and they said, okay, well, nobody wants to buy our revenue bonds anymore. We can't charge anymore for our ratepayers. Well, actually, before they went to Wall Street, they tried a really desperate move. They tried to dig a tunnel to connect their sewer system to a nearby jurisdiction so they'd have more ratepayers. So they can't increase the rate, we'll increase the ratepayer population. And that didn't work. They started the tunnel, it was extremely expensive, it had more debt, and it was determined to be unsound structurally before they could finish it. So they turned to Wall Street. I can't possibly cover this all in a few minutes, but they did some pretty exotic things. They exchanged their fixed rate debt for variable rate debt, float rate debt. They took out derivatives. Then they did some interest rate swaps. These are all things that people assume governments never do. They think this is all only in the business world. Derivatives, interest rate swaps are not terrible in and of themselves, but the swaps and the derivatives had embedded in them hundreds of $millions of fees that the federal government later determined were excessive. And it was actually a big part of the Dodd-Frank bill is trying to undo the proclivity of governments to get into these deals ever again. And also, these interest rate swaps needed, for Jefferson County to save money, they needed their payments to go down over time. Once the financial crisis happened, their payments went up. So ultimately, what they ended up with was no new sewer system and even more debt, just absolutely drowning in debt because the financial crisis sent the market in the wrong direction. And it turned out later that the reason they didn't build pipes, they built other stuff, was because public officials were being bribed to build the other stuff. And a lot of people would have said, well, Jefferson County, I don't really think of that place when I think of interest rate swaps. I don't really think of them when I think of derivatives and floating rate and variable rate. A lot of those financial transactions were based on bribery as well. 17 public officials went to prison, one for 15 years. So yes, corruption was there, but also just the monster debt load that left. The thing about bankruptcy is that's why this exists. They've got the debt load. Yes, it was due to corruption partially, but nobody's going to forgive the debt. There are still people who are owed these payments. So they had to go in and restructure their debt. So when you hear Jefferson County, a lot of times the next thing you hear is sewer system. Not a great association for Jefferson County, but that was the major reason that they ended up going into bankruptcy. And finally, Stockton, California. Stockton, again, had long-term economic decline, increasing crime. Just in general, the city was in decline for a long time. They had one particular liability they were worried about, and this is a story of pensions. If you look at this graph here, they have 2 pension plans. Most governments have between 2 and 6 pension plans. The blue bars for their miscellaneous plan, meaning general public employees. Safety is for their police and fire. Interestingly, their safety was less well funded than their general plan. It's usually the opposite. But if you look at 1998, like everything else in the world, both pensions were overfunded, right? 105% for safety, 125% for miscellaneous. Once the dot-com bubble burst, markets declined, the economy declined. We had a steep decrease in the funded status for those pension systems. Stockton was really worried about its ability to handle these liabilities long-term because they were in a long-term economic decline. There was no improvement on the horizon. So what they did in 2007, at the very top of the market, they issued $125 million in pension obligation bonds. So these bonds are backed by the returns on the pension system. If the interest rate that you're paying on the bonds is not significantly lower than your returns on your pension investments, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. Again, they issued it in 2007. In fact, they issued it just a few months before the markets crashed, the worst possible time. So what you see here is ultimately Stockton ended up with their pension systems being as poorly funded before 2007, but now they have $125 million in new debt. They have no new assets. They didn't come out of nowhere. So they said, well, we're just stuck. We hit the end of the line. We have to declare bankruptcy. A couple of themes here is that rules are very good. For instance, New York City was knocking on the door of bankruptcy in the late 1970s. It established a lot of rigorous rules to reform its budgeting process, and it not only survived but thrived. New York City is always the case that you throw in front of people when you want them to improve their budget system. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB, since 1984 has been very active in establishing rules to make financial reporting more transparent and consistent. It's been extremely active since the year 2000, when it started making governments go on full accrual accounting in addition to modified accrual and cash accounting. Everybody who took 1021 remembers this. So they've been extremely active, but rules are only part of the story. You can't mismanage even within a system of good rules. Just the fact that you have good reporting of your pension liabilities won't make them disappear. So incredibly, you actually see a lot of governments say, well, we're getting all these awards for our budget presentation, for our financial statements, but those are really awards for formatting. I mean, you have nice Excel tables. And so that's not really achieving anything. Actually managing matter. If you want to, for instance, go into the market and do things like interest rate swaps or derivatives, you have to know what you're doing or hire someone who knows what they're doing. And also don't take bribes. And in general, yes, this is common to the three cases of bankruptcy, but something I've really found consistent in my research is that municipal government in general is really not resilient to declines in economic growth. Almost every municipal government is dependent on a growth model, on property and wages. Really, none of them are resilient to that. So the concept of resilience, which is highly used in urban planning, is now being used a lot in finance. Governments are trying to figure out how to be more resilient to these, especially since we now know that economic decline can have no end in sight. The recession ended 5 years ago, but if you ask a lot of people, what do they think about the recession? They'll give you an answer because they think we're still there. And finally, systemic risk. When it comes to issuing bonds and relying on returns of your pension plan, or relying on your water bills, or even worse, relying on the general market when you buy derivatives or do swaps, it's really undercalculated. It's very much undercalculated. It's easy to sell a lot of municipalities on getting into these transactions, even if they don't really have a good sense of where the market is going to go. So a lot of the focus in municipalities now is education on systemic risk and resilience to economic decline. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And our final speaker is John Billings, who's Professor of Health Policy and Public Service. He directs our health program. Those of you who've been following healthcare know that one of the keys to our future success is controlling healthcare costs. And one of the ways to do that is to target and improve care for high-cost patients. John is one of the nation's leading experts, perhaps the nation's leading expert in this, and he's going to talk about that problem. John.
So I do understand that I'm the last thing between you and the cocktails upstairs. So I'm taking like a 20-minute presentation. I'll try to do it in 8 minutes, so good luck to me. So I'm going to talk, as Sherry suggested, about the research I've been doing that relates to identifying and trying to improve care for the very high-cost patients. But what I really want to talk about is how to do that in an evidence-based way so we can learn as much as possible. And I'm going to describe what we did in New York on a recent project. And we came very close, but ultimately totally failed. And I'll tell you a little bit of that story. And this focus on high-cost patients comes from a chart that looks like this, which is we know that roughly 20% of patients are driving 80% of the costs. And the project I'm going to talk about is something called the Chronic Illness Demonstration Project, which took a bunch of very sick Medicaid patients who were disabled. And even those very sick patients, it's a 20-77 rule, which is 20% of the patients are driving 77% of the costs. So that suggests you got to do predictive modeling to try to find out who those patients are. Because there's no new money, and if we're going to save money, we got to identify the patients who are the high-cost patients, and the intervention will have to pay for itself out of savings from those patients. That means that, again, the cost will have to be offset by savings. That means case finding is going to be very important. We have to find the patients who are going to be high-cost next year, not high-cost last year, because people who were high-cost last year aren't necessarily going to be a high-cost next year. There's regression to the mean. And resources on these patients who aren't going to be high cost next year is going to be wasted money. You're not going to be able to save any money. So that suggested to us that the focus should be on high cost events that you think you can do something about. And in the healthcare system, that means we're talking about hospitalizations. We're going to have to find hospitalizations. It's where the money is. It comes in big chunks. And there's lots of evidence that a lot of hospitalizations can be prevented. But we've got to understand this is going to be really hard. This is the Medicaid context, and these patients have lots of complex problems. There's lots of research suggesting some of these care coordination things can work in middle-class patients, but whether they can work on these really tough, high-cost patients in the Medicaid program remains to be seen. And by the way, this intervention has to take place in something called a healthcare system. I put that in quotes because most of you realize we don't have a system. We have a bunch of providers doing lots of different things, but not talking to each other a lot. So I'm a faculty member, I get to dream. So I'm going to sort of give you the idealized approach to how to do this on an evidence-based basis. So we said, let's see if we can predict who's going to be high cost next year using administrative data. Let's learn as much as we can about the characteristics of those patients from that administrative data to help design the intervention. Let's then try out the algorithm on a set of patients who look like they're high cost and find out from them what else is going on that's not in our administrative data. And then get a bunch of smart people in the room and design the intervention. Don't design the intervention before you know the data. Use the data to help design the intervention. Totally new concept. We tried it. And then the next idea is, well, let's then implement it, and let's implement it in an experimental mode so we can learn what's going on from these patients, and we can then help tweak the intervention, but assess the impact of it and do it in a way where we learn as much as possible. And then disseminate our results and scale it up if it works. And I bravely call this evidence-based management and policymaking. And what you're going to see is we didn't quite get there. So yeah, we almost got it right, but then not so much. So step one, we actually did this. So step one, we took Medicaid claims data from 5 years, and we tried to take the 4 years and predict what the remission was going to be in the 5th year. We used fancy regression techniques and come up with a risk score of 1 to 100 for everybody. And then we apply the results to real-time data and identify the patients who next year we think are going to be high cost. So these are the kind of things we looked at: prior hospitalizations, prior intervals of hospitalization, prior ED visits, emergency department visits, diagnostic information, the things that we thought in our data would help predict who's going to have an admission in the next 12 months. So we look back 12 months, try to then predict in our historic data what's going to happen in that 5th year, and then we apply it in real time. So here's our scorecard in the development run. So if you have a risk score cutoff of 50, we were right about 67% of the time. So it's a pretty good model in identifying who's going to have a hospital admission in the next 12 months. But we can learn more. We want to learn more about what these patients look like so we can design the intervention. So these are real sick people. Lots of chronic disease, lots of multiple chronic disease. And what you got to be asking yourself as I show you this data is, what should the intervention look like for these kind of patients? They got other problems too. Not only have chronic disease, they have a history of behavioral health problems, high rates of substance abuse, high rates of mental illness, and more than half have both. Oh, and many don't have a medical home. So remember, these are people with a risk score of more than 50. They're very sick patients. You saw how sick they were with chronic disease. Almost 20% have had no primary care or specialty care visit in the last 2 years. And then another 18% have multiple visits, but they're going to so many different providers, we call them shoppers. They don't really have a medical home. So as we think about the intervention for those patients, we're going to probably want to have a medical home for them. And oh, by the way, they cost a lot. So the average cost of these patients is $46,000, and $26,000 is in the hospital. But that helps us figure out how much we can pay for the intervention. We can make different assumptions about how many future admissions do you think you can knock out. That tells us how much we can spend on these patients on our intervention. So they end up, the state did a demonstration project where they end up spending about $3,000 per patient. And so that suggests they're going to have to knock out 13% of future admissions to break even. This is an ugly list of the kind of conditions these patients have in the hospital, and these are the things they have to knock out. So lots of substance abuse, lots of mental illness, lots of chronic disease. So we then did the next step, which is let's go try this and interview the patients to find out what's going on. And that turned out to be extremely important. So the first thing we found out is these people are incredibly socially isolated. 50%, more than 50% are living alone. Most of them never married. 16% have no friends or family. And another 48% have 2 or fewer. So these are very socially isolated patients, which means the intervention is not just going to be a healthcare intervention, it's going to be a social service kind of intervention. Many don't have a medical home. We already kind of knew that, but for them, for 42% to say their medical home is the emergency department was not a good sign. And then 60% have a housing problem. So we're going to have to recognize that if we're going to solve their problems. 28% were living on the street, 8% were in a shelter, and 24% were living with friends or family. And remember, these are substance abusing, mentally ill patients. That's not likely to last long. So we got a bunch of smart people in the room, or we thought they were smart, and try to figure out what it ought to look like. And I'm going to go through this, and you got to be asking yourself, well, how much can they really do of this? So the first thing, these are complicated patients, so you're going to need a multidisciplinary approach. You're going to have some sort of integrated, organized, coordinated healthcare delivery system. But not only that, they got social problems, so we're going to have that system coordinated as well. We're probably going to have somebody that's going to be a care service coordinator or ranger, give them a reasonable caseload size, and really give them the job of helping these patients solve their problems. Not necessarily health problems, that may be non-medical problems they have to help them deal with. It'd be nice to have data close to real time because we have no idea what we're doing. And if we want to learn along the way to try to make things better as we learn, we need to have close to real time data. And then you actually need some data in real time. If a patient's in the emergency room, you need to know about it because you need to get there and prevent them from being admitted by having a good community plan. If they're being discharged from the hospital, you need to know about it so you can have a good plan for them in the community. And then if the patient themselves think they're in trouble, you need to know about that. Now that problem got solved by some of the programs like giving them cell phones with a speed dial to the care coordinator. They lost a lot of cell phones, but it was a very effective technique. And finally, we're going to have to think about the incentives in the system. Most importantly, if we're not hospital admissions, we got to get the hospitals a little bit more comfortable with that idea by probably some sort of shared savings agreement. So that got us then to the next step, which is let's do a pilot of this intervention. Yeah, this is where the wheels came off, okay? So there's my list that I just showed you. And my best estimate is we could do two of those things. We could have teams that were interdisciplinary, and we can have a care coordinator. The rest of it was going to be really hard to do. But that didn't stop anybody. So the state went ahead and funded a $20 million pilot program. And as I said, they gave $3,000 per patient for the care coordination, $250 a month. Unfortunately, CMS, that's the Medicare or Medicaid folks, they said we couldn't randomize patients, which is going to make my trying to understand what really happened difficult. But we had a really great plan. What they said is you have to have the same services to every patient in the geographic area. So we said, okay, but we can have it in some geographic areas, not others. They said, yeah, that's fine. So we said, we'll do zip codes and we'll randomize them. Now, we didn't tell CMS we were doing that. We said, we'll do it in some parts of the state, not other parts of the state. We thought this was really, really clever. But you're going to see it didn't work. So basically, they started implementing it. And what they found was they couldn't find most of these patients because the address information they had wasn't very good. So when we gave them a list of high-risk patients, they only found 15 to 25% of them, which means my great plan of randomizing zip codes wasn't going to work because the people they found are going to be fundamentally different than the people they didn't find. And so I can't just compare people in the zip codes that has the intervention with the ones that are in the zip code without it. But in the middle of this, we have the Affordable Care Act, and they said, this is a great plan. Let's do it all over the country. And so they created a new program called Health Homes and special federal money, a 90-10 match for Medicaid if you do a program like this. So UNDOT in New York said, well, that's great. We'll expand our program of pilots from 2,000 people with a goal of going to 700,000 people. So I'd say the wheels came off here. Step 4, we did the scaling up okay. But we forgot about the rest of the stuff. And so I call this management and policymaking. This is pretty much what we do. So what's next? Well, we have another great plan. But you're going to have to wait till the cocktail hour to hear about it.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jonathan, Ingrid, Dan, and John. Don't you all want to come back to Wagner and do your degrees all over again? Let's give them another round of applause. And thank you so much for coming and enjoy the party.